Most people fight for attention. They try to stay visible. They try to stay available. They believe the more they show up, the more they matter. But disciplined people don't move like that. They protect their presence. They understand something most overlook. Being seen is temporary, but being remembered is power. Because attention fades the moment you leave, but when the mind keeps returning to you, that's influence. And the mind doesn't hold on to what is constant. It holds on to what feels unfinished, what carries weight, what doesn't need to prove itself. There's a quiet principle in Stoicism that most people miss. You don't control how often others think of you. You control your actions, your restraint, your timing. And from that, everything else follows. When your words are measured, when your presence is intentional, when you are no longer driven by the need to be noticed, something shifts. You stop reacting and you start shaping perception, not through force, not through noise, but through calm, deliberate impact. And that kind of presence is different. It doesn't chase attention. It doesn't compete for space. It stays. It lingers in the mind long after the moment has passed, not because it demanded attention, but because it earned it quietly. Most people believe influence is built through constant presence. They stay longer than necessary, stretch conversations, respond quickly, and avoid silence as if it weakens them. It feels logical. If you are always there, always visible, always engaged, then you should matter more. But something quieter is happening underneath that most never notice. The more available you become, the easier you are to understand. And the easier you are to understand, the less effort the mind needs to hold on to you. What requires no effort is rarely remembered. The mind is not designed to cling to what is simple and complete. It is drawn toward what feels unfinished, what carries tension, what invites a second look. When every interaction reaches a clean ending, nothing remains. No loose thread, no reason to return. The moment closes neatly, and the mind moves on just as neatly. But when something ends slightly before it feels complete, something shifts. The brain doesn't register closure, it registers interruption, and interruption creates continuation. That is where presence begins to transform. Not in how long you stay, but in what remains after you leave. When you step away while the moment is still alive, the other person's mind keeps going. It replays your words, studies your tone, and tries to resolve what you left open. And without realizing it, the interaction continues internally. That internal continuation is far more powerful than anything you could have added by staying longer. There is a discipline in knowing when enough has been said. Most people don't practice it. They feel the need to fill every silence, to explain every thought, to make sure nothing is left unclear. But clarity, when overdone, removes depth. It satisfies the surface while leaving nothing beneath it. And the mind does not return to what has already been fully resolved. It returns to what still feels alive. This is not about being vague or distant. It is about understanding that not everything needs to be completed in the moment. A short interaction, when it carries weight, creates more impact than a long one that slowly fades. The difference is not in duration, but in density. What you say, how you say it, and when you choose to stop all shape how the moment is stored. When you allow space at the end instead of filling it, you give the mind something to work with. And the mind, when given something to work with, continues long after you are gone. The mind is constantly trying to simplify people. It looks for patterns, labels, and quick conclusions so it can stop thinking. The moment someone feels predictable, attention drops. Not because they are boring, but because they are complete. There is nothing left to figure out. But when someone cannot be fully placed, when their reactions are measured instead of automatic, when their behavior doesn't follow a simple pattern, the mind stays engaged. It keeps observing. It keeps analyzing. This is not about pretending to be someone else. It is about not revealing everything at once. Most people rush to be understood. They explain too much, react too quickly, and reveal everything in an attempt to connect. But when everything is clear too early, there is no reason to look deeper. The mind moves on. Depth is created through layers, not immediate exposure. When parts of you unfold over time, the process of understanding continues, and that process is what keeps attention alive. At the same time, too much clarity removes tension. When someone knows exactly how you feel, exactly how you will respond, and exactly where they stand, the interaction becomes predictable. The mind relaxes, and interest fades. But when there is space, when not everything is defined, the mind fills the gap on its own. It replays conversations, searches for meaning, and looks for signals that were never fully explained. That is not confusion. That is engagement. The key is control. Not emotional inconsistency, but intentional restraint. You express enough to create connection, but not so much that there is nothing left to discover. Because once someone feels they fully understand you, they stop thinking about you. And if they stop thinking, your presence disappears. Everyone is drawn toward what improves them, even if they don't realize it. Not what entertains them briefly, but what elevates them internally. When someone leaves an interaction feeling clearer, sharper, more focused, your presence becomes associated with growth. And the mind holds tightly to anything connected with progress. Most people misunderstand this. They try to be liked instead of being impactful. They focus on comfort, on being easy to be around, on avoiding friction. But comfort relaxes the mind, and what relaxes the mind is rarely remembered. Impact works differently. It creates movement. It shifts something internally, even in a small way. It might be a single sentence, a calm reaction, or a perspective that reframes how someone sees a situation. These moments stay. Over time, people begin to associate you with that feeling of clarity, of direction, of quiet progress. And once that association forms, your presence gains weight. It becomes more than just interaction. It becomes influence. The same applies to emotional contrast. The brain does not remember consistency. It remembers change. When your tone and energy remain the same all the time, people adapt and stop noticing. But when there is controlled variation, when your presence carries range without losing stability, something different happens. A calm person showing intensity at the right moment stands out. A serious person allowing subtle humor becomes memorable. These shifts create emotional spikes, and the brain holds on to those spikes. Not because they are dramatic, but because they are unexpected. Over time, this creates a layered experience around you, one that feels alive instead of flat. And what feels alive is what the mind returns to. Most interactions don't lose their impact because they were bad. They lose it because they lasted too long. Every moment has a natural peak, a point where energy, attention, and engagement are at their highest. But most people stay past that point. They stretch the interaction until it fades, and what the mind remembers is not the peak, but the slow decline. Now imagine the opposite. Leaving while the moment is still strong, while the conversation still has energy, while there is still something left unsaid. The mind doesn't register completion, it registers interruption, and interruption creates return. It replays the last moment, holds on to the feeling, and keeps the interaction alive internally. At the same time, the fastest way to lose psychological weight is to signal need. The moment your emotional state depends on someone else's response, the dynamic shifts. Your presence turns into pressure, and pressure is something people move away from. But when your state is stable, when your attention is given but not dependent, your presence feels different. It feels chosen, and people are drawn toward what feels chosen, not required. When your life feels full beyond the interaction itself, your attention gains value. It becomes something that is offered, not something that is needed. And that shift changes everything. You are no longer trying to make someone think about you. You are creating a presence that naturally stays in their mind, without effort, without pressure, without force. If this way of thinking connects with you, then don't just listen to it, apply it, take it seriously. And if you want to keep building this kind of mindset, this kind of presence, then consider subscribing. Not as a habit, but as a choice. Because what you choose to return to shapes how you think, how you act, and ultimately who you become. Over time, this creates a different kind of presence. One that is not measured by how often you are there, but by how long you stay in someone's thoughts. You are no longer trying to occupy space physically. You begin to occupy space mentally. And that mental space is not controlled by how much you give, but by what you leave behind. The less you overextend, the more the mind fills in on its own. This is where most people get it wrong. They believe connection is built through constant interaction, but constant interaction often leads to diminishing returns. The more something is repeated without variation or restraint, the less impact it carries. What was once engaging becomes familiar. What becomes familiar becomes background, and what becomes background is eventually ignored. And once that presence takes hold, something interesting happens. You are no longer just part of the interaction. You become part of the reflection that follows it. The mind is constantly searching for patterns. It does this quietly, almost instantly, without effort. The moment you meet someone, it begins sorting, labeling, simplifying. Friendly, reserved, confident, predictable. It doesn't do this to understand you deeply. It does it to stop thinking about you. Because once something is categorized, it becomes easy. And what is easy does not demand attention. It fades into the background, processed and stored without resistance. That's why most people, even those who are kind, interesting or well-intentioned, become forgettable. Not because they lack value, but because they become clear too quickly. Clarity, when it comes too early, removes curiosity. The mind no longer needs to explore. It no longer needs to question. It feels finished. And when something feels finished, attention drops naturally. Not out of disrespect, but out of efficiency. The brain is designed to conserve energy. It focuses on what is unresolved, what is incomplete, what still requires interpretation. So when someone presents themselves in a way that is fully transparent from the beginning, there is nothing left for the mind to engage with. It understands, labels, and moves on. But when something is not fully defined, the process changes. When your reactions are not immediate, when your behavior doesn't follow a rigid pattern, when your emotional responses are measured rather than automatic, the mind cannot finalize its judgment. It stays open. It keeps observing. It tries to find consistency, but it doesn't settle easily. And that lack of closure creates engagement. Not forced, not dramatic, just a quiet, ongoing attention that continues beneath the surface. This is not about being confusing or unpredictable in a careless way. It's not about sending mixed signals or acting against your nature. That creates instability, and instability pushes people away. What holds attention is something more refined. It is controlled variation, a sense that there is more beneath what is visible, but it is not revealed all at once. It is the difference between chaos and depth. One repels, the other attracts. Most people reveal everything too quickly because they believe it builds connection. They share their thoughts immediately, react openly, express every emotion as it appears. It feels honest, and in many ways it is. But honesty without restraint removes intrigue. It gives the full picture before the other person has had a chance to explore it. And without exploration, there is no investment. The mind does not engage with what is already complete. It engages with what still feels layered. There is a quiet discipline in holding parts of yourself back, not as a strategy to manipulate, but as a form of control. You choose what to reveal and when. You allow different aspects of your personality to appear over time instead of all at once. This creates depth, not because you are hiding something, but because you are not rushing to expose everything. Depth cannot exist where everything is immediately visible. The Stoics often spoke about control, not just over actions, but over expression. Not every thought needs to be spoken. Not every emotion needs to be displayed. There is strength in restraint. There is clarity in measured response. When your reactions are not automatic, they carry more weight. They feel intentional. And intention is something the mind pays attention to, even if it cannot fully explain why. As Epictetus once said, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. When everything about you is known too quickly, there is no reason for the mind to return. But when there are layers, when understanding comes gradually, the process continues over time. Each interaction adds something new, something slightly different, something that prevents a final conclusion. And as long as there is no final conclusion, attention remains active. This creates a shift in how you are perceived. You are no longer just another person who is easy to read. You become someone who requires attention to understand, not in a complicated way, but in a way that feels real, grounded, and slightly out of reach. And that slight distance is enough to keep the mind engaged without creating frustration. People often believe that being liked comes from being easy to understand. And while that can create comfort, it does not create memorability. Memorability comes from depth, from the sense that there is more beneath the surface than what is immediately visible. When someone feels that, they continue to think about you, not because they are trying to, but because their mind has not finished the process. Over time, this becomes a pattern. Not a rigid one, but a consistent approach to how you present yourself. You don't rush to explain. You don't react instantly to everything. You allow space for interpretation. And in that space, the mind begins to work on its own. It looks closer. It listens more carefully. It pays attention to details that would otherwise go unnoticed. And that attention is what most people are trying to achieve, often in the wrong way. They try to earn it through constant presence, through more words, more effort, more visibility. But attention is not created through volume. It is created through depth, through the subtle tension of not being fully understood all at once. When you begin to move this way, something changes. You stop trying to be fully seen immediately. You allow yourself to be discovered gradually. And that process of discovery is what keeps you present in someone's mind long after the moment itself has passed. There is a difference between clarity that builds understanding and clarity that removes depth. When someone knows exactly how you feel at all times, exactly how you will respond, exactly where they stand with you, the interaction becomes predictable, and predictability relaxes the mind. It no longer needs to search for meaning. It no longer needs to revisit anything. The emotional equation is complete, and once something feels complete, attention fades naturally. But when there is space, when not everything is fully defined, the process changes. The mind doesn't close the loop. It keeps it open. It returns to moments, replays conversations, looks for meaning in small details. A pause becomes significant. A slight change in tone becomes something to interpret. Words that were not fully explained begin to carry more weight than the ones that were. And without realizing it, the person is thinking about you long after the interaction has ended. This is not confusion. It is not about creating doubt or instability. There is a clear difference between being unclear and being controlled. Uncertainty driven by inconsistency pushes people away, but space created through restraint draws people in. It gives the mind something to engage with without making it feel lost. It creates curiosity instead of frustration, and curiosity is what keeps attention alive. Most people struggle with this because they feel the need to be understood immediately. They want to make sure nothing is misinterpreted. They want to clarify every thought, every feeling, every intention. It comes from a good place, but it removes the very thing that creates depth. When everything is explained too quickly, there is no room for discovery, and without discovery, there is no investment. As Carl Jung observed, the most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. There is a kind of strength in leaving certain things unsaid, not because you are hiding, but because you understand that meaning does not always need to be delivered directly. Sometimes it is more powerful when it is found. When someone reaches their own conclusion, it stays with them longer than something that was simply given. The mind values what it works for, and when it works to understand you, it holds onto you. This requires control. Not emotional suppression, but emotional discipline. You feel what you feel, but you do not express everything immediately. You allow space between impulse and response. You choose when to speak and when to hold back. That space, even if small, changes the entire dynamic. It shifts you from reactive to intentional, and intention carries weight. As one insight puts it, he who is brave is free. That kind of freedom is not loud. It does not demand attention. It shows itself in restraint, in the ability to not overexplain, to not rush into clarity, to not fill every silence. Because silence, when used well, is not empty. It is active. It gives the other person room to think, to interpret, to engage with what is not being said. Over time, this creates a different kind of interaction, one that feels layered instead of flat. There is always something just beneath the surface, something that has not been fully revealed, and that feeling keeps the mind involved. It doesn't move on quickly. It stays, not because it has to, but because it wants to resolve what is still open. There is also a shift in how you are perceived. When you do not rush to explain everything, your words begin to carry more weight. People listen more carefully. They pay attention to what you say, but also to what you don't say. And that balance between expression and restraint creates a sense of depth that cannot be forced. It is easy to think that saying more will make you more understood, but often it does the opposite. It removes the need for the other person to think. It gives them everything at once, leaving nothing to return to later. But when you leave space, when you allow certain things to remain undefined, the mind continues the interaction on its own, and that continuation is where real presence is built. Not in the moment itself, but in what follows it. In the quiet reflections, in the repeated thoughts, in the small details that gain significance over time. That is where influence begins to take shape. Because in the end, it is not what is fully explained that stays. It is what invites thought, what leaves a trace, what continues to exist beyond the moment itself. Everyone is drawn toward what improves them, even if they don't always recognize it immediately. It's not always loud or obvious. It's often subtle, a shift in how they think, a slight increase in focus, a feeling of calm that wasn't there before. These are the moments the mind remembers, not the entertainment that fades quickly, but the presence that leaves something behind. Because the mind is not just looking for distraction, it is always searching, quietly, for direction, for something that feels like progress. Most people confuse this. They believe connection is built through comfort alone. They try to be agreeable, easy to be around, consistently pleasant. And while that can create short-term closeness, it rarely creates lasting impact. Comfort relaxes the mind. It makes things feel safe, predictable, easy to process. But what is easy to process is also easy to forget. The mind does not hold on to what requires no effort. It holds on to what changes something internally, even in a small way. That's where the difference begins to show. When someone leaves an interaction with you feeling slightly sharper, more aware, more grounded, something shifts in how they perceive you. You are no longer just part of their environment. You become part of their growth. And growth is something the mind prioritizes without needing to be told. It assigns value to it automatically. It returns to it naturally. This doesn't mean you need to constantly teach, correct, or guide. In fact, Forcing that often creates resistance. People don't respond well to being told what to do. They respond to what they feel. So the real question becomes more subtle. What does your presence create in others without you trying to control it? Do they feel clearer after speaking with you, or more distracted? Do they feel more focused or more scattered? These small shifts define how your presence is remembered. There is a kind of influence that comes from example rather than instruction. When your thinking is structured, your energy is calm, and your words carry intention, people notice it without you needing to explain anything. They feel the difference. And over time, they begin to associate you with that feeling. Not because you told them to, but because the experience speaks for itself. As one idea reflects, the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. That quality becomes visible in how you speak, how you respond, how you carry yourself. And when someone interacts with you, they come into contact with that quality, even if only for a moment. If it is scattered, they feel it. If it is focused, they feel that too. And what they feel is what they remember. This is where impact begins to replace simple likability. Likability is often based on ease, on being agreeable, on avoiding friction, on maintaining a pleasant surface. But impact comes from depth, from creating a moment that stands out, not because it is loud, but because it shifts something internally. It might be a single sentence, a calm reaction in a tense moment, or a perspective that reframes how someone sees a situation. These moments stay. Over time, people begin to recognize the difference, even if they cannot explain it. They notice that interactions with you feel different from others, not necessarily more intense, but more meaningful. There is a sense of direction, of clarity, of subtle forward movement, and the mind, without being told, begins to return to what feels like progress. There is also a contrast that starts to form. When someone experiences a presence that elevates them, other interactions may begin to feel less engaging by comparison, not because they are worse, but because they do not offer the same sense of movement. And once the mind becomes aware of that difference, it starts to prioritize what gives it more clarity, more focus, more depth. This is how value is created without being forced. You are not asking for attention. You are not trying to hold on to it. Your presence earns it because it contributes something that the mind naturally seeks. And when something is naturally sought, it does not need to chase. It draws people in without effort. People often underestimate how much these small moments matter. They think impact requires something dramatic or obvious, but it rarely does. It builds through consistency, through repeated experiences that each leave a slight impression. Over time, those impressions accumulate, and what started as a small shift becomes a lasting association. So the focus changes, not on being liked in every moment, but on being meaningful in the moments that matter. Not on filling space, but on adding something to it. Because in the end, the mind does not prioritize what is simply present. It prioritizes what adds value to its experience. And once that value is recognized, something deeper begins to form. Not just attention, but respect. Not just familiarity, but significance. And that significance is what keeps your presence alive, even when you are no longer there. The brain is constantly filtering what matters and what does not. It does this quietly, without effort, reducing everything around you into patterns it can recognize and store efficiently. When something stays the same for too long, it becomes predictable. And once something becomes predictable, it loses its intensity. Not because it is bad, but because it no longer requires attention. Familiarity softens the edges. It turns what once felt sharp into something smooth, something easy, something that no longer stands out. This is why consistency, while valuable in character, can become a limitation in expression if it is not balanced. If your tone, your reactions, your emotional presence remain exactly the same in every situation, people adapt quickly. They learn your rhythm. They begin to anticipate your responses before you even give them. And once that anticipation sets in, attention fades. The mind no longer needs to observe closely because it already believes it knows what is coming next. But when there is variation, something changes. Not chaos, not instability, but controlled contrast. A shift that is intentional, grounded, and timed with awareness. When someone who is usually calm expresses intensity at the right moment, it carries weight. It signals that something matters. When someone who is often serious allows a moment of lightness, it feels genuine, not forced. These small deviations from expectation create movement, and the brain notices movement. The mind is drawn to change because change signals importance. It breaks the pattern. It interrupts the automatic processing that would otherwise occur. And when that interruption happens, attention sharpens. The moment becomes more vivid, more defined. It is not lost in the flow of everything else. It stands out. And what stands out is what is remembered. This does not mean becoming unpredictable in a careless way. That kind of unpredictability creates confusion, and confusion leads to distance. The goal is not to be inconsistent, it is to have range while remaining stable at the core. Your foundation does not change, but your expression adapts. You remain grounded, but not flat, present, but not repetitive. This balance is what creates depth. Most people operate within a narrow emotional range. They default to one tone, one type of response, one way of interacting. It becomes their pattern. And over time, that pattern becomes invisible. Not because it lacks value, but because it lacks variation. The mind no longer registers it as something new. It blends into the background. But when your presence carries subtle shifts, the experience becomes layered. One moment feels focused and controlled. Another carries a slight warmth or humor. Another shows intensity when it matters. These shifts do not need to be dramatic. In fact, the most effective ones are often quiet. They are felt more than they are noticed, and that is what makes them powerful. The brain encodes moments of change more deeply than moments of sameness. A brief shift in tone, a pause where there is usually speech, a reaction that differs from expectation. These become anchors in memory. They give the interaction shape. Without them, everything blends together. With them, certain moments stand out clearly. Over time, this creates a pattern that is not predictable, but not random either. It feels natural, but not obvious. People begin to notice that interactions with you are not flat. They carry movement. They hold subtle variation. And that variation keeps the mind engaged without overwhelming it. There is also an emotional effect that comes with this. When warmth or attention is constant, it can begin to feel automatic. It loses its impact. But when it appears selectively, when it is expressed at meaningful moments rather than continuously, it feels more valuable. It feels earned. And what feels earned is remembered more strongly than what is given freely all the time. This is not about withholding in a calculated way. It is about understanding that value is not created through constant output, but through intentional expression. When everything is always available, nothing stands out. But when there is rhythm, when there are moments of presence followed by moments of restraint, the experience becomes more engaging. The mind begins to anticipate without fully predicting. It stays attentive because it cannot settle into a fixed expectation. And that attention is what keeps your presence active in someone's thoughts. Not because you are doing more, but because what you do carries more weight. So the shift becomes subtle but significant. You are no longer operating on a single emotional note. You are creating variation within stability. You are allowing different aspects of your presence to appear at the right time, in the right way. And in doing so, you give the mind something it cannot ignore. Because in the end, it is not consistency alone that creates memorability. It is the contrast within that consistency. The moments that break the pattern just enough to be noticed. just enough to be remembered, just enough to stay. Most people stay too long, not because they lack awareness, but because they fear losing the connection. They try to hold on to the moment, to stretch it, to keep it going just a little longer. It feels harmless at first. One more sentence, one more explanation, one more attempt to maintain the energy that is already beginning to fade. But the moment doesn't stay at its peak. It declines, slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed. And by the time the interaction ends, the strongest part of it has already passed. The mind does not store the full timeline of an experience evenly. It compresses it, it simplifies it. It remembers the emotional high point and the ending. Everything else becomes secondary. So when an interaction continues past its peak and ends in a flat, ordinary way, the memory of it weakens. Not because the moment itself lacked value, but because it was not preserved at its strongest point. There is a different way to approach this. One that requires awareness, but also restraint. Instead of holding on to the moment until it fades, you step away while it is still alive, while there is still energy in the exchange, while there is still something left unsaid. This creates a very different kind of ending. It does not feel complete. It feels interrupted, and that interruption does something powerful to the mind. When something ends before it feels finished, the brain does not close it. It keeps it open. It replays the last moments, not out of effort, but out of instinct. It tries to continue what was left unfinished. It returns to the feeling, to the tone, to the small details that were present at the peak. And in doing so, it extends the interaction beyond the moment itself. This is where most people misunderstand connection. They believe it is built by maximizing time, by staying longer, by saying more, by making sure every possible thought is expressed. But connection is not strengthened by overextension. It is strengthened by preserving the quality of the moment, by ending it in a way that leaves something behind. There is also a subtle signal in leaving at the right time. It shows that your actions are not driven by impulse. You are not reacting to the moment in a way that tries to hold on to it. You are choosing when to step back. That choice reflects control, and control, even when quiet, changes how you are perceived. It creates a sense of independence, a sense that your presence is not shaped by the moment, but by your own awareness. As one reflection suggests, it is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor. That craving often appears in small ways, like the inability to leave a moment at its peak, the desire for more time, more interaction, more continuation. But that desire weakens the impact. It stretches something that should have been preserved. When you begin to act differently, something shifts. You no longer feel the need to exhaust every moment. You allow it to remain slightly incomplete, and that incompleteness becomes its strength. It gives the mind something to return to, something to replay, something that does not feel fully resolved. There is also a rhythm that starts to form. Interactions become shorter, but more defined, more intentional. They carry a beginning, a rise, and an ending that feels deliberate rather than accidental. And over time, people begin to notice that time with you feels different. Not rushed, not distant, but contained, focused, complete in a way that does not rely on length. This creates anticipation, not because you are creating distance, but because you are preserving the experience. When something ends at its peak, the mind does not feel relief. It feels continuation. It begins to look forward to the next interaction, not out of habit, but out of genuine interest. Because the last moment did not fade, it stayed alive. Most people never reach this point because they are focused on maintaining the moment instead of shaping it. They react to the flow instead of guiding it. But once you become aware of the pattern, it becomes easier to adjust. You begin to notice when the energy starts to shift, when the peak has been reached, and instead of staying, you step back. That step back is not loss, It is preservation. It protects the strongest part of the interaction and allows it to carry forward. It turns a single moment into something that continues in the mind long after it ends. So the focus becomes more precise. Not how long the interaction lasts, but how it ends. Not how much is said, but what is left behind. Because in the end, the mind does not hold on to duration. It holds on to intensity. And intensity, when preserved at the right moment, does not fade. It lingers. The fastest way to lose presence is to make it feel necessary. The moment your attention carries need, something shifts in a way that is difficult to see but easy to feel. It becomes heavier, less fluid, less grounded. It stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a requirement. And people move away from what feels like a requirement, not because they intend to, but because the mind naturally resists pressure. It seeks what feels light, what feels voluntary, what feels free from expectation. This is where most people unknowingly weaken their own impact. They look for reassurance in small ways. A quicker response, a clearer signal, a confirmation that they are valued. It seems harmless, even human, but beneath it there is a quiet dependency forming. Their emotional state begins to adjust based on how others respond. When attention is given, they feel stable. When it is delayed or reduced, they feel unsettled, and that instability transfers into the interaction itself. Presence, when it is influenced by need, changes its nature. It stops being something that adds to the moment and becomes something that asks from it. And that shift, even if subtle, is felt. The interaction no longer feels balanced. It feels tilted, not dramatically, but enough for the other person to sense it. And once that sense is there, attention begins to pull away, not out of rejection, but out of instinct. But when your state remains steady, something very different happens. Your attention is still there. Your engagement is still real. But it is not dependent. It is not tied to an outcome or a reaction. It exists on its own. And that independence creates space. Space that allows the interaction to breathe. Space that removes pressure. And in that space, your presence feels lighter, more natural, more grounded. As Seneca once wrote, "He who is content with what he has is rich." There is a kind of strength in not needing the moment to confirm anything for you. When your sense of stability does not rise or fall based on how someone responds, your presence becomes consistent in a deeper way. Not predictable, but grounded. You are not adjusting yourself to maintain the interaction. You are simply participating in it. And that difference is subtle, but powerful. As one reflection suggests, no man is free who is not master of himself. That mastery shows itself most clearly in moments where dependency could appear but doesn't, where attention is given but not chased, where engagement is present but not attached to validation. It is a quiet form of control, not over others, but over your own reactions. When people sense this, even if they cannot explain it, they respond differently. Your presence feels self-contained. It does not feel like it needs something from them, and because of that, it becomes easier to engage with. There is no pressure to respond a certain way, no expectation to maintain a certain dynamic. The interaction feels voluntary, and what feels voluntary is more appealing than what feels required. There is also a shift in perception that comes with this. When your life appears full beyond the interaction itself, when your focus is not centered entirely on the other person, your attention feels selective. It feels like it is given by choice, not by necessity. And that selectiveness increases its value, not because you are withholding, but because you are not overextending. Most people try to hold attention by giving more of it, more time, more energy, more focus. But this often creates the opposite effect. It removes the sense of choice. It makes the interaction feel automatic. And when something feels automatic, it loses its significance. But when your attention is balanced, when it exists alongside other priorities, it feels intentional. And intention carries weight. This does not mean becoming distant or disengaged. It means maintaining a sense of internal stability that does not rely on the interaction itself. You are present, but you are not dependent. You are engaged, but you are not attached. That balance creates a different kind of connection, one that is not driven by need, but by choice. Over time, this becomes noticeable, not in an obvious way, but in how the interaction feels. There is a sense of ease, a lack of pressure, a natural flow that does not feel forced. And because of that, people are more willing to move toward it. Not because they are pulled, but because nothing is pushing them away. There is also a deeper effect. When someone realizes that your presence is not dependent on their response, they begin to shift their focus. Instead of feeling responsible for maintaining the interaction, they become curious about it. They begin to wonder how they fit into your world rather than how you fit into theirs. And that shift in focus increases their attention naturally. This is where presence becomes something that is discovered rather than requested. It does not seek validation. It does not ask for reassurance. It exists on its own, steady and contained. And because of that, it becomes easier to value. Not because it demands importance, but because it does not depend on it. So the focus changes, not on trying to make someone think about you, but on removing the need that weakens your presence. When that need is gone, what remains is something much stronger, a presence that is grounded, intentional, and free from pressure. And that kind of presence does not chase attention. It allows attention to come naturally, because it feels like a choice, not a requirement. In the end, it was never about being everywhere. It was about being remembered in the right way, quietly, without force, without chasing, just a presence that lingers because it carries weight, control, and intention. If this way of thinking stayed with you, then don't let it end here. Choose the next step. There's a video on your screen that will deepen this even further. Watch it and keep building that kind of presence. And thank you for being part of Stoic Journal.